Hi, Craig Payne here. I felt compelled to do this video because of the extraordinary amount of misinformation that I was being bombarded with in social media and in the blogosphere and other places that I think are leading to some bad clinical decisions. So what is posterior tibial tendinopathy or tendinitis? It's a training load error or an overuse injury to the tendon of the posterior tibial muscle. Typically the symptoms of this are just above, just behind the medial malleolus, and there may or may not be some swelling. What it is not, posterior tibial tendinitis or tendinopathy is not posterior tibial tendon dysfunction. These are two totally different entities, and this is where a lot of my exasperation is coming from, that people are confusing the two terms and mixing them. You'll see an article written on posterior tibial tendon dysfunction in runners and advice for what a runner should do, but when you read it, it's pretty damn obvious they're talking about posterior tibial tendinopathy. And if someone really did have post-tib tendon dysfunction and they followed that advice, they will have, I have no doubt that they will have an adverse or a worse outcome. Post-tibial tendon dysfunction in runners is extremely rare. I've blogged about this, and if a runner has post-tib tendon dysfunction, I tell them to give up running. It is that serious. Okay. Yet what you read online, the confusion of the two, the advice given for one, thinking it's the other. Whenever I see a runner asking in a forum asking for advice on post-tib tendon dysfunction, I sometimes join up anonymously, and the first thing I say, how sure are you it's post-tib tendon dysfunction and not tendinitis? Almost every time they come back and they say, well, it's actually tendinitis. And as it says there, the Dunning-Kruger effect is strong in this one. And if you don't know what the Dunning-Kruger effect is, or Google it, look it up. So what causes posterior tibial tendinopathy? When the cumulative load in the tendon exceeds what the tendon can take. So it's the cumulative load and what the tendon can take. We're going to keep coming back to those 2 points. So what causes an increase in that cumulative load beyond what the tendon can take? And it's training load errors. They are good old-fashioned too much too soon. The tendon has not been given time to adapt to increasing distances, or the tendon wasn't given time to adapt to a change in the running technique or a new pair of running shoes or something like that. Mechanical factors. Now, invariably online you will see that flat feet, overpronation linked to post-tib tendon tendinopathy. I just fell into the trap I was just talking about. No. You can have a very severely overpronated foot and not get post-tib tendinopathy. Now, it's all about joint moments. Now you think about it for a moment, what is the function of the post-tib muscle and then through its tendon? Its main function is to apply an inversion moment to the rear foot. That means the muscle fires to try and invert the rear foot. It may or may not invert the rear foot, but it tries to. Okay, so when that is high, you have a higher mechanical load. Now you could have an overpronated foot and that force could still be low. You could have a supinated foot and that force could be high. So it's all about those inversion moments, those rear foot inversion moments. And those joint moments are in turn determined by lever arms that the tendon has to joint axes. And we're going to talk about that. There are genetic issues. I'm aware, and there are probably even more than this, over a dozen studies that looked at genetic risk factors for Achilles tendinopathy, and one study that has looked at genetic risk factors for post-tib tendon dysfunction. No studies looked at post-tib tendinopathy, but there's no reason to assume they're not the same. And there are genetics issues. Now, where I think they come into play is they affect the ability of a tendon to adapt. I mean, some people can adapt to higher loads really quickly. Some people need a lot longer time. So that's where I think where the genetic factors come in. And again, tissue health, and that's nutritional issues, the right nutrients. Is the tendon healthy? And if it's not healthy, it's obviously going to be exposed at risk. So how do you treat it? Well, I think it should really be obvious. Reduce the load in the tendon and increase the ability of the tendon to take the load. And I think with most overuse or training load error injuries, that's what I keep coming back to. And the third point there, facilitate healing. So how do you reduce the load? Stop. don't run anymore, or whatever activity you're doing. Now, obviously not practical, so it's that good old-fashioned activity modification where you reduce the total amount of activity, you do a different activity, cycle rather than run, or swim rather than run, or something like that. You know, this is what we've been doing for a very long time for this, so it's reducing the load that way. Another way to reduce the load is use strapping or tape, especially in inversion or antipronatory taping. But that tape has to be aimed at reducing that rear foot inversion moment, not correcting overpronation or not supporting the arch. Now, if you try and support the arch and you try and correct that overpronation, you may address that rear foot inversion moment, but you really need to focus that. Now, this will not work on all feet. It will depend on what is causing that higher inversion moment in the rear foot. And in some foot types rather, that the strapping works really, really well. In others, nope, it's not going to work at all. So it's not about strapping works or doesn't work, it works in the right kind of feet. And picking them is not necessarily that difficult, but I don't have time in this short video to get into all those kinds of issues. But I look at strapping as a very short-term measure. The other way to reduce the load is foot orthotics. And it's not about using an insert to treat overpronation or getting the foot into subtalar joint neutral or supporting the arch. It's all about having the design features that reduce that rear foot inversion moment. It's not about prefabricated orthotics or custom-made orthotics. It's all about reducing that rear foot inversion moment. You can do that with any of those. How do you reduce that rear foot inversion moment? And this is the key point here. You have to ensure that there is the required amount of material on the medial side of the subtalar joint or rear foot axis. Now, when I say the required amount, you might need a lot or might need a small amount depending on the magnitude of that rear foot inversion moment. And as we also know, that subtalar joint or rear foot axis varies quite substantially from person to person. And you need to get that material on the medial side of that joint axis. Now, using something like an arch supporting insole from over the counter or prefabricated, if that has quite a high arch design on it and nothing on the medial side of that joint axis, that is going to make it worse. It's going to be uncomfortable. That is going to be a pronatory influence on the foot. And again, if you don't know or understand or don't know what I mean by all this, you probably shouldn't be doing it. But I also look at orthotics as a short to medium term measure. I think they're awesome short term measures to reduce the load while the tissues heal. And maybe into the medium term. They may or may not be needed long term, and we'll come back to that. What about running shoes? Can running shoes reduce the load? And of course we're talking about your motion control stability shoes here. And we know from the evidence that they tend to not control rear foot motion. But motion is not necessarily related to that rear foot inversion moment. So is there a design feature in running shoes that can reduce the load on the pathological tissues? And that's what medial posting does. If you can imagine in a neutral shoe, here's ground reaction force here. You take a medially posted shoe, that ground reaction force is going to be over here. It's going to have a lever arm to that rear foot axis. So therefore, yes, that's going to help reduce that rear foot inversion moment. Yes, that is going to reduce the load in the post-tib tendon. But it's not the overpronatory design features or the arch supporting design features. It's the design feature that moves that centre of the ground reaction force. Now, again, that won't happen in all feet. It all depends on where that rear foot axis in the foot is. And the shoe can move that lever arm the ground reaction force has to that axis if it needs to be moved in that particular foot type, and it doesn't necessarily do it. Now, millimetre shoes will increase the load. Millimetre shoes don't have that ability to move the ground reaction force, so it gets a lever arm. So, first point, reduce the load. That's how you do it. The second one is you increase the ability of the tendon to take the load. And that's where there's got to be those slow, progressive increases in activity levels. That's where the eccentric loading programs come into it. They help that ability of that tendon to take the load. If you change the running technique, change the shoes, it's that slow adaptation that the tissues have. And the tissues are remarkable. They can adapt. You want to get rid of orthotics, you do this. You know, short to medium term orthotics, you do this medium to the long term. So orthotics to reduce the load, the short to medium term, this to make the tendon better able to take the load medium to long term. And and you won't need that load reduction if the tissues get adapted. So it's not one or the other, it's short to medium versus medium to long term. And then the third point is facilitate healing. And that's where ice, NSAIDs, your cross-frictional massage come into it, your electrical therapeutic measures, manual therapies. I'm sure there's some people inject cortisone into tendons, hopefully they don't, but all those are aimed at facilitating the healing of the damaged tissue. Now, to me, they're not a waste of time. I question their effectiveness over a longer to a medium term if you don't reduce the load and if you don't increase the ability of the tissues to take the load. To me, those two are the key, and these other modalities just facilitate the healing within that process. What about stretching? And you'll come across a lot of advice online about stretching for post-tib tendinitis. And a bit of critical thinking. During gait, that post-tib muscle tendon complex never reaches its end range. So how does stretching help? Now, if a tendon is tight and you reach the limit of that joint that tendon crosses when you're walking, running, whatever, yes, I can see how stretching could help. But in this situation, we never actually reach it. So how does increasing the range of motion help when we never actually reach? Well, that tendon never actually reaches its end range of motion. Now, of course, a flexible muscle is better than a tight muscle, but I just question the advice of stretching to help this. What about strengthening? Now, think about this one. We've got a tendon here that's sore, and here's a muscle that's attached to it. How does making that muscle stronger help that tendon that's damaged? I don't get it. How does making that stronger actually help? Of what benefit is there by making the muscle attached to the tendon that's painful? I don't comprehend how that would help theoretically. Okay, now obviously a stronger muscle is better than a weak muscle, so I'm not saying doing the exercises. Where I do think stretching and strengthening help in something like post-tib dysfunction is they help that process of the tendon adapting to the load. So the stretching and strengthening put a load through the tendon that help it adapt to be able to tolerate the loads placed on it. So it's not the actual absolute strength of a muscle or the range of motion that tendon allows to happen at the joint that's important, but it's the actions of strengthening and stretching probably help the tendon adapt. And hopefully you can see there's a subtle difference between that and what I was just talking about. What about changing the running technique? You see a lot of advice given on that. My mantra is different running techniques and different running shoes load different tissues differently in different runners. So what change or what running technique helps post-tib tendinopathy? Heel striking. Forefoot, midfoot striking increases the load on the post-tib tendon. Heel striking, it will be lower. Now, forefoot, midfoot striking will be better for other injuries. So it's all about picking the running technique that reduces the load on the tissue that has the damage in it. And in this case, the loads are going to be lowest when they're heel striking. What about the long-term use of foot orthotics? And again, the Dunning-Kruger effect is so high in what you read and hear people say about this. To say foot orthotics should never be used in the long term is just as stupid as saying that everyone should use them. Okay, there is no evidence foot orthotics do any harm in the long term. Foot orthotics certainly do not weaken the muscles. You see that claim made so often, and I keep going, Dunning-Kruger, Dunning-Kruger. How about a nice big cup of research before you say something stupid? 4 studies have looked at foot orthotics and muscle strength. They've all found the same thing. It's not a problem. So, foot orthotics, short to medium term, perhaps the tissue adaptation, medium to long term. When will you need to use orthotics long term? It is going to happen. It does happen sometimes. It's the long term use of foot orthotics are indicated when the loads are really, really high, and the tissues can't adapt, or the effort involved to adapt those tissues to the loads are so high. Those people will probably benefit from a more longer term plan to reduce the load. I mentioned earlier about the potential genetic risk factors for posterior tendinopathy. In those people, the ability of the tissues to adapt to the load appears to be impaired somewhat. So they are better off in a long-term load reduction strategy. Tissue health if the tendon is not healthy, and of course compliance issues. It does take a lot of effort to comply with the eccentric loading programs and the slow progressive adaptation. And if the patient or the client or the runner is not prepared to do that, they will benefit from a more long-term load reduction plan with foot orthotics with the right design features. Not the arch supporting, not the subtalar joint neutral. The design features that put the load on the medial side of that subtalar joint or rear foot axis, and that axis varies substantially from person to person. So I put this video together to illustrate, critical thinking skills, please. Reduce the load, increase the ability of the tissues to take the load. That's what it's about. Again, I put this together because I just felt like ranting. Critical thinking, but I get exasperated about the amount of superficial understanding that is leading to bad advice online and obviously poor clinical decision making. My other reason for putting this video together was not that I want to promote my clinical biomechanics bootcamp that's now online. I just wanted to use this. These are the issues we cover in great detail in the clinical biomechanics bootcamp. And a few people have asked, can I have some examples of some of the content you cover? Well, this is what we cover in an extraordinary amount more detail. And in this short video, obviously I can't go into a lot of detail about any of these points, but I hope you found it useful.